Thank you, and thank you to the National Committee of the Sciascia Century, because the Italian Cultural Institute worked very well with the committee, which is constituted by prominent scholars and also by true prominent personalities like Emma Bonino and Della Vedova. They are part of the Italian government, and this is gives the idea of how much important Sciascia was, not only in the field of literature, but in the field of society, of civil engagement. He was really an intellectual like Pasolini was, able to move the society and to give his perspective on, I think, almost all the field of Italian 20th century. I am very pleased to introduce Gaetana Marone Puglia from Princeton. She is a dear colleague, an expert, great expert on 20th century literature and movie and films. And Joseph Farrell, who wrote an amazing book about Sciascia. It's so interesting that Sciascia comes from Sicily, is really rooted on this island, and in the same time was able to become a sort of a global writer. So that our best book on Sciascia is written in English and not in Italian by Joseph Farrell. And at this point I will sit there because I'd like to enjoy your conversation. Please welcome Gaetana Marone Puglia and Joseph Farrell.
Okay, this is beginning in a very Italian way, that's to say with a certain element of uncertainty, but I'm delighted to be here. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not Italian nor American, I'm from Scotland, but I've always loved Sicily and in particular Leonardo Sciascia. So very briefly, if I can talk about my connection. I remember very clearly the first time I read Leonardo Sciascia. It was in 1970. I had just left university, and we went on holiday to an area of England, the Lake District, which those of you who read the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, will recognise. I went not with the poetry of either of these men, but with a couple of the novels of Leonardo Sciascia, and was then overwhelmed by them. I did meet Sciascia a couple of times, only a couple of times. I discovered when I go to Sicily nowadays that the island is full of people who were close friends, intimate friends, dear friends of Leonardo Sciascia. If poor Sciascia had known all of these people, he would not have had enough time to eat or to sleep, let alone to actually write books. So I only met Sciascia a couple of times. And I have an anecdote about that. When I met him first, I was staying with some friends in Licata, which is along the coast from Racalmuto, where Sciascia lived. And his grandson was there, Vito Catalano, who is now a good friend of mine, a dear friend, an intimate mind, un caro amico. At that time, Vito was just a boy, and he was fascinated by hunting, which of course is a very Sicilian activity. So every time anyone mentioned an animal, Vito would ask the one question, ma quest'animale cos'è, vivo o morto? Well, he was told that a very unusual animal was coming that day to the farmhouse, a British professor, un professore britannico, and Vito asked the question he always did, ma questo professore britannico, vivo o morto? And it seems that Sciascia said, vediamo, vediamo. I would give anything to know what Sciascia's judgment was at the end of the day, whether he decided I was vivo or morto. I wrote a book on Sciascia published by Edinburgh University Press in 1995. I was then invited by Francesco Izzo, who was then the president of the Associazione Amici di Sciascia. The initial plan was to really republish that book, possibly updating it here and there, but that basically was impossible. There has been so much work done on Sciascia by so many people. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a new book, but I will confess that I have incorporated into it some parts from 1995 of my own which seem to be valid, still to be, but as I said, I have widened out my own interest. There has been much more written about Sciascia in the meantime, so this book, which was commissioned, so to speak, by the Amici di Sciascia and was published by Oski, this is the one we have. I'll come back and speak a bit more about my own approach, but I think I should shut up now and let you listen to Gaetana and also to Valerio. So.
Thank you very much. As you can hear from an accent, I'm not Scottish, but I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much to the Rizzoli and all the staff, and you all for being here, finally present. So that's kind of special. And thank you very much for Fabio Finotti that he will host the conference that we will be here in New York after tomorrow and Friday, the colloquium Sciasciani. That is very important, that we decided to devote to the myth of the American literature and the myth of the Mediterranean literature. So the two coasts of the Atlantic or the ocean that meets finally around the idea of literature, and so the representation of the difficult reality the United States and Italy were and are living. So it's very nice to be here presenting a book that the Associazione Amici di Leonardo Sciascia was founded in Italy in 1993. That with the aim is a no-profit cultural organization with the aim to spread the message of Leonardo Sciascia and to let younger generation to read an author that we believe is more important day by day, and especially probably after September 25th, when in Italy they will vote again. So it's still wonderfully actual, and this is one component that is very important. Leonardo Sciascia loved the United States as many Italian writers during the fascism, as you know, a projection of something all over overseas, to dream about a country without borders in a way. But Sciascia, smart as he was, when he was really young, he just published a book of poetical prose, Favole della Dittatura, 1950, majestically translated by Angles, then recently, actually a year ago if I'm not wrong. And then in 1952, La Sicilia il suo cuore, poems. As every good narrator started with poems in a way, if you think, even American one. And then in 1952, he wrote a voice for the encyclopedia in Chicago in English on the Italian literature in 1952. So Leonardo, not Sciascia, wasn't famous, was called by Americans to write about Italian literature, what's going on at that time. Pasolini was born in a way, Mario Tobino, and so on. And so actually he was welcomed here in this country even before he was well known. And so he started working on American literature, reading Faulkner, for example, reading Steinbeck, Caldwell, Hemingway, and so on, and understanding that even so far away they could share the same aim for freedom and civil rights at that time. So as Associazione Amici di Leonardo Sciascia, it's a long time we are working to study the reception of Sciascia all around the world. And so we published 4 books. This is the 5th one. 1 on Middle East, Germany, Yugoslavia, Switzerland, and we are working on France and United States. But we were forgetting something and someone. Instead of geographical exploration, thanks to Joseph Farrell, now we have the inner exploration of the self. So the man and the writer. And this is, we think, a very important book because of that. As Fabio Finotti said, it's in English because we believe that Sciascia is kind of global, in the sense that his message can travel. In fact, as you can see, the association is crossing the border to reach the European values of the writer. And so, this book is particularly important because who is the man, who is the rider, which is the connection between the two, and the differences between the two. And it's very important for students. I'm very happy today we have the Gaetano students to understand nowadays that a rider is not a rock star and a man is not a loser. You know what I mean? But we can find a compromise, and the compromise is to understand how difficult is the reality, and how so the difficulties are pushing up, out something important in us. So Giuseppe Tornatore, in his introduction, as you said before, says, this book is an attempt to unravel the nature of Sciascia's vision, its basis in his Sicilian experience, curious or otherwise, and to explore the wider implications of the use of Sicily as metaphor. Yeah, Sicily as metaphor, reality as metaphor, and so literature as metaphor to understand the reality. We think this book is all around. It's starting really to understand, if we read the table of contents, the difficulties, the puzzling Sicily, to arrive to understand the connection between Sciascia and the Sicilian verismo, for example, so Pirandello, Verga, first of all, De Roberto, Console, and all the other Sicilian writers that are well explained, for example, in the book. So it's not a book just on Sciascia, the man and the rider, but a man and the rider in the second half of the 20th century trying to struggle to understand its own identity and the identity of the nation in which it's working. But not only, even crossing the borders, and so arriving, as we are today, and we are very proud to be here, arriving in the United States. And so to show how a writer can be really useful and important, even in translation. There is a sentence I really like about the book, since the book starts from Le Favole della Dittatura, so the first work by Sciascia. Joseph Farrell writes, the opening line of Sciascia's version of the fable is a quote from Phaedrus, reproduced in Latin, superior stabat lupus, the wolf stood above. Words which have the function of Dante's motto, abandon hope, all ye you enter here, at the entrance to Inferno. There is no hope in the green, inhuman world where the wolf rules and the only law is the law of strength. Every generation is a criticism from barbarity. The veneer of every civilization is frail. Humans behave with the brutality attributed to the animal kingdom. Ethics do not hold sway. This is exactly what students are experiencing, we are experiencing, and we are looking in books. The answer, or at least suggestion to go ahead. As Gord Vidal wrote the New York Reviews of Books in 1979 about Sciascia, what is the mafia mentality? What is the mafia? What is Sicily? When it comes to exploration of this particular hell, Leonardo Sciascia is the perfect Virgil. And I think today we can say, who is Sciascia? Who is Sciascia mentality? When it comes to the explanation of this particular writer, Joseph Farrell is the perfect Virgil. And to be a Virgil in this case is someone that knows the brutality of reality and can spread a light before we go. Even if probably the man and the writer, Joseph Farrell, in this case, prove his own pain, understanding better Sicilian like Sciascia. A Sicilian because he's Anglo-Celtic, as you like to define yourself. So an Anglo-Celtic that messed with a Sicilian author. Now I would like to add something maybe personal. I'm teaching in the United States since 12 years. No, I'm lying. I'm teaching in Mississippi since 12 years. That's kind of but that's great because I'm teaching at the University of Mississippi where Fabio Finotti next week will give an important lecture, the most important lecture of the university, the longest lecture. Longest doesn't mean it has to be long. Is the last name of the donor. But we are very proud of that. And the University of Mississippi is in Oxford, where William Faulkner used to live, as you know. And William Faulkner used to say, to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. And Sciascia used to say, you have to go to Sicily to see how incredible Italy is, and so to understand the Italian European world. As I said at the beginning, Italian literature is devoted to American literature in a moment in which dictatorship were ruined the Renaissance in a way, you know what I mean? So all the values of Italian culture. And Sciascia understood that. And William Faulkner was depicting the South, the segregation, all the problems that the South had. I'm saying the South, not the South of Mississippi. The South is always something similar. the south of Mississippi or United States, like the south of Sicily. And this is one of the first connections that we will explore thanks to the Italian Cultural Institute after tomorrow and the day after. And so this book even is reconstructing in a way the interest of Sciascia in American literature. And this is something that we think is very important to locate Sciascia in the time of fascism and so dictatorship, to understand how literature can be a way to communicate with other brothers, even at the other part of the ship. Thank you very much, and welcome to Joseph Farrell to New York.
Well, let me once again begin by thanking l'Istituto Italiano di Cultura and Fabio Finotti for organizing not only this presentation in such a prestigious place like Rizzoli, and also the conference, but I also would like to thank Valerio Capozzo for the time he has spent in bringing together such distinguished scholars, being a scholar himself. So I think, Joe, you will be very much challenged tonight and the days to come. I'm the only one who is really not technically a Sciascia specialist. Joe and I go back quite some times. I would say a long time. We collaborated on projects, theater, Sciascia, and I would say I'm very moved of being here with Joe tonight in presenting a book that is the definite book on Leonardo Sciascia. And as Valerio has mentioned, not only is the book on Sciascia, but it's also introduced by Giuseppe Sonnatore, a Sicilian who knew Sciascia very well, who had the cultural span of the Sicilian. And Joe, you are, quote unquote, a foreigner. I am myself a Sicilian. And frankly, Sicily is not the south. Sicily is an island that has writers and artists that can span through the globe. And the great merit of this book is, first of all, to go beyond Sciascia the Sicilian, Sciascia the Southerner, Sciascia the Italian, but analyzing the writer as a global writer. And I may say, in a very, so to speak, that I knew Sciascia myself when I was a student and I began collaborating with Novecento in Via Siracusa, and he used to walk down Via Siracusa going all the way to Sellerio, because he was the editore in Casa Sellerio. We used to wait, but of course he belonged to the opposition, so there was never much interaction. And so, as a Sicilian myself, not only I endorse what Giuseppe Petruccio Tornatore has written in the introduction, and Tornatore is not easy to convince to write an endorsement. But I would say that what captured me most is the journey that Farrell took into the complexity of the Sicilian culture and how well he could navigate it. Not only the writer, but the man. And when you try to cross that boundary, you take a great risk. Not only when you meet the person and you begin having also a relationship, to maintain a distance that allows you not only to carry through your analytical thoughts, but also to bring them in, is one of the most difficult tasks. And these tasks, Joe, did attention to the late work celebrates one of the great masters of world literature. In 10 chapters, Farrell vividly and thoroughly presents Sciascia's elaborate historical research, the compositions of his fictions, the so-called detective story, and non-fiction, the invented genre, the essay inquiries, the nuances of the storyteller, a witness and a politically and socially engaged critic. Not only the mafia, Sicily and the mafia are almost inevitable as an association, but fascism, and also its position against historical compromise. The focus of the book is on Sciascia's particular style and richness of themes that are analyzed within a classical architectural figure, the labyrinth, and its ethical and political values, which Farrell calls civic humanism, and deep rootedness in the culture of Sicily, which is by no means a regional Sicily. Farrell's wild cultural insights, as it was just mentioned, with a mosaic of profound influences, ranging from Voltaire, Montaigne, Pascal, Stendhal, Cervantes, Tolstoy, Borges, Pirandello, Manzoni, but also painters such as Chagall, Velázquez, Durer. In TODOMODO, for example, the narrator is a celebrated painter, and so on and so forth. So Farrell really captures the spirit of the man and the writer with the cultural wide spectrum of knowledge, which is very Sicilian. And I'm not saying that lightly. I grew up in the north, I lived in Sicily, and I graduated from the University of Palermo, so I'm very much aware of how Sicilians think, although I was always considered a continentale in Sicily, because I grew up in the north. And I would like to bring in the two words also on the character of Sciascia, that was not really an easygoing person, even if he had such a public persona. Tornatore, Andò told me in the past episodes about Sciascia, they were both very close friends, where if he would find a meeting not to his liking, and this comes up in the book, he would just walk away. Like when Sergio Leone called him to collaborate on the film, but Leone was bossy. Leone had a tough personality, and Sciascia walked away, never wanted to do anything with Leone. The focus on Sicily is also read as a crucible, where the past, i.e. tradition, implies continuity over time. The present is very important for Sciascia, and he collaborated constantly with the newspapers Laura, but also the future. So his journeys into the past are a way of understanding the present and also to prepare us for the future. He warned us against the loss endured by Sicilian writers when they try to move out from their roots, and the example you bring very well is the one of Vittorini, the industrial Vittorini, but also Lampedusa. We all know Lampedusa, and we love his statement in The Leper, we are the gods, the ones who will come, the hyenas. Sicily is the Sicily of the grand past. So immobility, that immobility Sciascia defied, and it's very well presented in your book. Rather, Sciascia saw in the because it asserted civil and human rights and provided the basis for justice and rational conduct. I could bring many, many examples, but I will let you later on bring in, but beginning with the day of the Aula, il giorno della Civetta. Many of these books were adopted by filmmakers. This was adapted by Damiani. The mafia culture is analyzed as power relations whose power players are in the capital, in Rome. In il contesto adapted by Francesco Rosi as Cadaveri Eccellenti, Sciascia describes it as an analogo of power in the world and expands the figure of the law, judges, detectives, and lawyers who are products of the system of power as figures rarely positive. Sciascia's skepticism over justice and its administration, however, is not without hope. Corruption is a permanent feature of society. However, Sciascia does not close, even when he analyzes highly documented cases like in Porte Aperte, again adapted by Gianni Amelio, or in the detective stories, Simenon and Agatha Christie as his favorite writers. The clash that comes to the fore in the book is a clash that at the time many artists in Italy were analyzing, and it is the clash between order and chaos. And for Sciascia, the study of the criminals, the detections of the crime, the dynamics of order and chaos acquire a metaphysical value. So the detective is engaged in the pursuit of truth, which can only be relative. And let me close very briefly with one of your statements in the book. Sciascia's inquiries are counter-inquiries to establish the factual truth against injustice, documented with his own minute research. And whether we think of Morte dell'Inquisitore or we address one of the great tragedies of Italy's L'Affaire Moro, the controversial book that Sciascia wrote and called a religious book after being appointed as a member of the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry on the Aldo Moro's assassination. He was convinced that the Red Brigades were not external products, but embedded into the Italian system, and criticizes the political and legal, all venues that made Moro an isolated figure and brought that to his death. The same approach comes to an intellectual as inquiry that is La scomparsa di Majorana, about the physicist who began working with Enrico Fermi, and for Sciascia, he glimpsed to the future and the atomic bomb. He basically mysteriously disappeared after buying a ticket to take the boat from Palermo to Naples. So the final chapters of the book, and I'm concluding here, address Sciascia's dissatisfaction with the political system. A communist by heart, he began wondering where the party was leading its course when we began to discuss the historical compromise. That is the way the opposition would govern with the Christian Democrats in order to prevent the country to fall into a right mode. And I like very much the closing on the theme of death with stories like Il Cavaliere e la Morte, or anche il Teatro della Memoria on a case of disputed identity. And I happened to discuss with Natalie Davis, who wrote a year later the book The Return of Martin Guerre, how much she loved the book by Sciascia, and how credible she felt his research, which was less expansive than Davis, but she was a faculty at Princeton at the time. She admired, but I like the closing lines of this book. Farrell writes, "The possibilities open to justice are limited, and it is on this note of the failure of justice that Sciascia's fiction ends." And so we will have to start from here on Sciascia, who closes on this line. But thank you so much for this very rich book, and a great book, a great homage to Sciascia.
Thank you very much.
Okay, can I just say something, and I'll try and keep it brief, and a couple of headings. First of all, let's be quite precise. The Sciascia belonged to a Sicilian tradition of literature. Now, we must understand that very precisely. First of all, he acknowledged a debt to Pirandello, who lived in the same part of Sicily as did Sciascia. He wrote several books on Pirandello, and his last one was entitled Pirandello, My Father, Pirandello mio padre, which was a lecture which only appeared in publication. What's important was that initially when he read Pirandello, he recognized that this was the Sicily he knew, and he was dismayed by that. He was completely upset by the recognition that the dilemmas, the tumult, the turbulence described by Pirandello, particularly in his short stories, much more than in his plays, was exactly the reality that he lived. He found a compensation to that, as Gaetano was saying, in his discovery of American writers, which happened immediately after World War II, when fascism was lifted and when it became possible to read some Americans, Dos Passos, in particular Hemingway, of course, Saroyan, and some others who impressed him enormously. But I want also to put this the other way around, because when he was writing about Pirandello, he said, if Pirandello had not gone to Germany, if he'd not gone to Bonn to study, critics would have regarded him as differently, would have regarded him quite differently. That, and particularly, he said he would have been known as Pirandello from Girgenti. Girgenti was the name for Agrigento until Mussolini insisted on bringing it closer to the classical past. And to explain that further, he referred to two American writers who are probably better remembered in Italy than they are in America itself. And allow me to change glasses, because my memory is failing, and I don't want to get this in any way wrong. The two writers were Edgar D. Masters and Sherwood Anderson. The former was the author of Spoon River Anthology, which I don't think, I may be wrong, is much read in America, but is still very much admired in Italy. And the other was, as I say, by Sherwood Master, and one of his books was called Winesburg, Ohio. He said that if Pirandello had not gone to Bonn to study, he would have been known as Pirandello from Girgenti. Now you can debate that, but Sciascia's point was that whereas Pirandello became known as one of the great writers, playwrights above all, of European irrationalism, and Sciascia had no track at all with irrationalism. He was completely and absolutely a rationalist. If he'd not gone there, he would have been recognized as a Sicilian writer. But we have now to ask, what does that mean? What does that mean? To be labelled in English provincialist or provinciale in Italian is not regarded as in some way demeaning someone. He's not capable of dealing with the big themes. I think this is untrue, and I'll quote it in English. When he was writing about Russian novelists, Sciascia admired Dostoevsky, but was not very keen on Tolstoy. He writes, under any circumstance, however limited is the geographical space in which a writer lives and of which he tends to give a representation, the more possible it is to reach universality. This is a direct quote. I would like at this point to go on and say that provincialism doesn't actually exist as a demeaning critical faculty. The great writers were always provincial. Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, Cervantes of La Mancha, Dostoevsky and the Russians, whom he was actually talking about, Dickens of London, Balzac of Paris, and above all James Joyce of Dublin. But the supposed provinciality of these people allowed people from other countries to recognize something of them. So one of my favorite quotes about Sicily was made not by Sciascia, but by another writer whom he admired, Giuseppe Antonio Borghese, Borghese, who lived a long time in America in exile from fascism. Borghese describes Sicily, and it's a magnificent paradox, as un'isola non abbastanza isola, an island which is not island enough, which is open to the world. So when Sciascia did a magnificent interview book with a woman, she was French, her name was Marcel Padovani, it was entitled Sicily as a Metaphor. Sicily as a metaphor. And that's why Sciascia is and can be appreciated everywhere. He was not only examining Sicily in itself. If I can go on, if you permit me, just very briefly, and Gaetana and Valerio have both already said this. Sciascia wrote in two particular styles, the detective story, and he read very, very widely in what we call the classical detective story, which is written in English, Agatha Christie, Ella Stanley Gardner, although the detective story writer he managed and admired above all was Simenon Maigret. Sciascia was not interested in who done it, but why it was done. In other words, if I can be very brief, a classical detective story has three elements: the crime, the investigation, and then the identification of the criminal. Sciascia's detective story has the crime and the investigation, but not the third element, not the satisfactory identification and handing over of the criminal to justice. That part is actually missing. Why is that? Well, because in the classical Anglo-American detective story, we can assume that there is an alliance, a meeting of interest between society and the detective. Sciascia, writing primarily of Sicilian society, says that alliance is not there. Why not? Because society itself is corrupt. Corrupt in what way? Well, here we could go on to talk about the mafia. that the mafia which imposes its own way, and he talks, Valerio said, about a mafia culture. The mafia which produces in this Sicilian word omertà, which cannot be translated exactly into English but means a code of silence. In other words, in particular in his first book, The Day of the Hour, Il Giorno della Civetta, whereas a detective story would normally go in one direction, in Sciascia's novel there is a two-way. The detective who is honest and who is trying to unmask the criminal, but then at the same time figures of power in church and state go in the different direction. So in Sciascia's novel there is a two-way process underway. The unmasking and then at the same time the cover-up, and the cover-up is carried out by people in possession of powers. That is to say, or that permits him later on to use the mafia as a metaphor, not just the Sicilian mafia in the strict sense, but as a metaphor for power. What is it that makes Sciascia, above all, and I've more to say, but I'll stop with this so as to allow people to come in. Sciascia was principally interested in a number of ethical, political values which we can call truth and justice. And in an age which has come to be labelled and to identify itself as a post-truth age, it's important to listen to people like Sciascia, who also admired George Orwell, to say we have to unveil the truth, we have to identify the truth. We have also then to stand for justice as against the injustices. He identifies three great forms of political injustice: the Inquisition, fascism, and he will include Stalinism along with that, Stalinism, and then mafia activity, which is of itself injustice. That's what he's looking for, both in his detective stories and in this other genre, which basically invented the inchiesta, which I've translated, as Gaetano was kind enough to quote, as the essay inquiry, which is almost the genre which he actually examined. That's to say that he stands then for these values, ethical and political values, which are most discussed in our age, in America, and in many, many other countries, not only in America. That's why I think it's really important for us to rediscover Leonardo Sciascia.
If there's any questions for Joseph Farrell?
Hi, good evening. Thanks so much for coming here and telling us about your exciting book. What influence, if any, did Sciascia's reading of Borges have on Sciascia's work? I mean, two great but very different writers, but with some affinity.
That's a very, very interesting question indeed. Sciascia admired Borges. He came across Borges' work really at quite an early stage in his life. He wrote some articles for a Parma newspaper, La Gazzetta di Parma, on Borges, when Borges was pretty well unknown, not only in Italy but also in the Anglophone world. But then you want to talk about influence, and then it becomes very, very difficult, in my opinion, to actually pin down influence. We'd have to be precise when we're talking about Sciascia, about the kind of books that he wrote and the things which interested him. And frankly, Borgesian fantasy was simply not one of those. We don't have, in any of the many, many works that Sciascia wrote, any sign of that kind of fantasy. He was much more concerned with concrete reality. So the writers that mattered to him and that influenced him were, on the one hand, Pirandello, as I mentioned, and the other hand, I didn't, but Valerio did, Voltaire. And these almost balanced each other. Sciascia had no sympathy with irrationalism and ignores that aspect of it. It might even be that it was necessary for him to find Voltaire who meant reason, la ragione, la raison, as a counterbalance to the chaos which he saw in Sicily. So I've thought a lot about your question, and I'm sorry I can't give a satisfactory answer to it. I can only use, and it's a trite phrase, and it doesn't convince me that we have actually a kind of attraction of opposites, because fiction of the sort that Borges wrote was not something which Sciascia ever wrote. But he did admire, I mean, they knew each other, they met various occasions. He did admire and got on very well with Borges, but they were very different writers.
I'm curious to see his response, Sciascia's response to the film Illustrious Corpses as compared to the book it was based on, and what is it, Equal Danger, translated in English as Equal Danger, in the film Illustrious Corpses.
Yeah, I don't like the translation Equal Danger, and as a matter of fact I don't use it in my book, which might cause confusion, because that is the title given to the English translation. To Each His Own seems to me a perfectly good translation, and it has an ecclesiastical overtone. It's almost a definition of the idea of justice. What is justice? Well, we've been debating that since Socrates, and we haven't actually come to a satisfactory answer. But to each his own is as reasonable a definition of justice as we've come to, so I would prefer to stick to that. To answer your question, Sciascia was fascinated by cinema, but he always recognized it as being a separate art. So he, basically having signed it over, he allowed the director to get on with it. He was uncertain of certain aspects of that particular film, but he regarded, or was prepared to consider cinema as an art parallel to the fiction that he wrote, and not to criticize unduly what they did with it. I think there was an exception to the first film, Il giorno della civetta, The Day of the Owl, where the plot was changed quite considerably from what he actually had. Some people might regard it as a change for the better because he introduced a stronger female element into it, but it was not there, and he was critical of that. When he was dealing with Francesco Rosi, he had a high regard for him, a high respect for him, and whether he was pleased with the outcome or not, he did not publicly attack the film that was made.
If I may complete your being so close to Francesco Rosi myself, Sciascia immediately agreed to give the rights. They had the same approach that you have described in the film to the mafia, to the criminals, to the idea of the truth that will never be uncovered. Sciascia gave a public reply saying that the film was very faithful to his book, because they agreed on the approach that you so well describe in your chapter on Il Contesto. They had the same view of the problems, and Rosi was also against the historical compromise. So Sciascia did approve, and that's because of my personal relationship. But in your chapter, it comes out very well that was Rosi's interpretation.
Yes, about the truth and justice, Sciascia. How was interest, I mean, during the 60s, when he was writing a lot of his books, here in the United States, there were, Martin Luther King was killed before President Kennedy, then Robert Kennedy. So how did you react? Do we know what he thought about those big episodes in American history where justice, you know, somebody can still think today that for certain episodes, the justice and the truth, the real truth wasn't there. Did he ever write anything about it?
To the best of my knowledge, he did not write anything about the specific assassinations that you referred to, Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy. I may be wrong in that, but I haven't come across any specific reference to that. But I'm prepared to be corrected on that particular point. On the wider thing, remember that Sciascia was a man very much of the left. He was never a member of the Communist Party, and indeed was critical of the Italian Communist Party. But when he took part in active politics on 2 occasions in his life, he became a city councillor in Palermo, but as an independent in the ranks of the Italian Communist Party. This position was facilitated by the proportional representation system, which was used in Italy, still, well, it's been changed, but it's still largely there. Later on, when he joined, when he became a member of the Italian Parliament, as Valerio mentioned, he was a member and a full member of the Radical Party, the Partito Radicale Italiano, one of whose members and a colleague was Emma Bonino, who is now the honorary president of the Amici di Sciascia. Now, the Radical Party was a different party from all the rest of it. It did not impose a strict line. It was a radical party, it was a party of the left, but it did not have a strict ideology. It did not require strict discipline following. It was, in other words, the ideal party for Leonardo Sciascia, who was incapable, not temperamentally, but intellectually incapable of following any imposed line. So he was there. As has also been mentioned, one of the reasons, I'm sure, that he accepted to stand and was elected was because Parliament was going to look into the assassination of the politician Aldo Moro, and Sciascia had already written a book on that. And once again, he was a member of the Commission of Inquiry, but he wrote his own minority report on it. He wouldn't quite go along with the majority report. But it was these particular, then come back to America. There was also a vein of anti-Americanism in his thinking. And he specifically says that while he loved America for, well, American cinema, Hollywood, and in particular for this list of American writers that he gave, which Valerio mentioned, which I've given, he gives slightly different lists, but I mean, these were well-known 20th century American writers, and he admired them enormously, as we said, they influenced. But in one of his places, he says, he also came to understand that the America which had produced these excellent writers was the same America which was responsible for some of the corruption in Italian politics, and specifically had been responsible for the growing or the re-emergence of mafia power. So he was not an uncritical admirer of America, of American power by any manner of means. But I repeat, I'm not aware, I'm sure he was as appalled as everybody else by these assassinations, but I'm not aware of any writing which he dedicated specifically to them.
There is something really nice to be in the United States now and to have the opportunity to have this colloquium that we will do and today, and all the activities that Associazione and Comitato are organizing, because Sciascia was really well informed about the social non-violent movement of Mississippi, for example, and civil rights, because he had a lot of correspondences or letters with Americans, intellectuals or editors of the New York Times, for example, that they were informing him. So he didn't know about what was going on in the South through the newspapers only, but the direct voice of people that white people that decided to go from New Jersey or New York to Mississippi, for example, to help black people in that time of segregation. So actually, this is the new chapter that we are studying, the new chapter we are exploring to make the book on the American reception of Sciascia and the Sciascia reception of the real and deep United States. And I would like to leave you with the last question. What was the reaction of FBI to Sciascia's books, because that's another thing that we will discuss during the colloquium. Because obviously the mafia in the United States in the 60s didn't accept, for example, a book like Mafia Vendetta, so The Day of the Owl, when it was published in 1964 by Knopf in New York. And so the FBI opened a dossier on Sciascia. And this is everything I'm saying, completely overlooked. And that's why we're here, to study in your archives and to tell you what we have to say, and to correct Joseph Farrell finally. Who said it.
Do you want to close with any? We're about at 1 hour, or over 1 hour, so I'm afraid we have to wrap up, but if you have any final remarks.
Do you have a final remark? A final remark? Thank
Do
you.
you want to do one more? We can do one more. Here, go ahead.
Thank you.
Mr. Farrell, you had mentioned that, I believe you said that Sciascia was an admirer of Pirandello's short stories. I happen to be translating several of his short stories right now. What was it in particular that attracted him to the short stories?
Oh, it was precisely the Sicilianness. But I mean, the short stories, not all of them, but the vast majority are set in Sicily. In other words, that they were directly a reflection, a discussion of Sicilian life. That was what drew it to him. That is also the case with Pirandello's early theatre. I mean, some of the short stories, as I'm sure you're aware, he then translated or transformed, adapted for the theatre. But it was the fact that these stories were dealing explicitly with Sicilian themes, were giving a depiction of Sicilian life. That's what drew him to that, and we'd said that we could talk about Pirandello di Girgenti rather than the wider European Pirandello, which he also admired. I mean, he wrote a lot about Pirandello. I mean, 3 main books, as Valerio mentioned, and many articles, reviews, and so on. But it was that in particular, I think. Final remarks. Okay, I don't think I have any final remark to make, except to say I'm very grateful to everybody who's coming. When I've been giving a talk recently, I've ended up with words which might seem almost flippant. On Sciascia's tombstone in Racalmuto, he inscribed the somewhat enigmatic, or rather, he dictated, said he wanted to inscribe the somewhat enigmatic epitaph. We will remember this planet, is what it says. I think it's now time that this planet remembers Leonardo Sciascia, and I think it would be better if we did.